that's based on historical relationship of what's happened in the last 15 years. Okay. So that gets into the point of what happens here is this is implemented at the point of extraction because administratively that's much easier. This paper came out after I did this study, but there's a nice Brookings paper by a woman named Adele Morris, who's their kind of carbon tax person. She's a Princeton grad, so is right. But she basically said, and some co-authors, but she said that to do a carbon tax at the point of extraction or import, you'd only have to tax about 10,000 entities, like legal entities in the United States. For comparison, IRS processes about 250 million tax returns, either individual income or corporate income a year. So as a scale of the problem relative to our income tax system, whether it's group or individuals, this is a very, very small issue to be taken care of, relatively speaking. It's maybe a little more complicated on the margin, but it's not that many entities to actually tax. We take 100% of this money and return it to all American households, basically not quite a per capita concept. You can see the gold point under there. There's kind of some adjustments made for family size. Monthly. The idea of monthly, of course, is you only have to carry a balance on each individual household's budget sheet, essentially no longer than 31 days. People wouldn't have to deal with higher prices for the course of the year. They'd have to deal with higher prices for the course of the month, which is easier. There's no eligibility requirements to this, as we can see. Like I didn't put up, you have to be, there's no tax cut involved, you don't have to have taxable income, anything like that. Basically, the only eligibility requirement would be having a Social Security number, which all natural citizens and all naturalized citizens and all legal immigrants already have. Administratively, this isn't my idea, but someone proposed like a Social Security Administration could do this pretty easily, given that they already send out hundreds of millions of checks over the course of the year to administer the social entitlement state. So basically, they're paying you to have a Social Security number. They're almost paying you to breathe. This may seem a little crazy, but there's actually one state that does this. Alaska. Yeah, it's the Alaska Permanent Fund. Alaska taxes the extraction of coal, oil, and gas resources. They don't call it a carbon tax, but there's a carbon price equivalent on it, so they're taxing extraction. They take that money and put it into a sovereign wealth fund, which is managed. This is different. There's no management here. It's just a straight rebate. But that fund it's a bank account that's invested, and it gets a certain amount of dividends and capital gains every year. And they rebate kind of whatever their formula says the profit of it is. And last year it was about $2,000 a person. I think it was $1,800 or something like that. Welfare economists would call this the foundation of what's a guaranteed income or a guaranteed minimum income. It's basically a supplement or replacement to the current welfare state, where instead of mostly being given in-kind benefits, like food stamps, like Medicaid, you're just given cash and allowed to take care of yourself. This is different, though, because it's mostly going to have to go to paying the higher energy costs. It's not really a welfare system. It's really a rebate back to the higher energy costs. And the third part, border adjustments. This is an interesting point. And this is one thing that distinguishes this study from a lot of the other macro studies out there, because they don't include something like this. They just assume that the border is kind of open. So imagine you have a really carbon-intensive product, steel. Indiana or Pennsylvania makes most of the steel in the United States. I'll say Pennsylvania. Right now, with a carbon tax, with this situation up here, you need a lot of both electricity and a lot of coal for coking to make steel. It's a very carbon-intensive product. Theoretically, what could happen is you could just flood the North American or the American market with cheap German or cheap Chinese or cheap Indian imports and drive American producers out of business. That doesn't help our economy, it helps theirs. And then it also doesn't really defeat the carbon issue because that just moves the production and the emissions overseas. What this border adjustment says is that, all right, so the American steel is more expensive. What we're going to do is when that German steel, just picking on Germany here, gets to the port of Baltimore, gets to the port of Newark, it's going to have the same carbon price put on it. Elementary international trade theory tells you what matters is relative prices, comparative advantages. Those wouldn't change under the circumstances. Everybody's product's more expensive. The market, broadly speaking, for, say, building materials or aircraft or equipment, maybe they need to shift into wood products or composites or something like that and away from heavy metals, but it wouldn't mean that there'd be less or more production amid the United States and other countries. Our market share would stay the same. So this protects the competitiveness of American firms, and it protects the fact that this doesn't lead to carbon leakage someplace else in the country. Turn it around the other direction. Let me finish real quick on that one. Turn it around the other direction. let's say you have a grain farm in Wisconsin or Iowa or something, and they're exporting out of the port of New Orleans. Theoretically, agriculture is actually, farms as a whole are extremely energy-intensive enterprises, just altogether. So theoretically, a bulk commodity like corn or soy or something like that would have the same problem trying to export. So you forgive or you rebate the carbon tax at the border, so when it's leaving the United States, you have the same issue. It's expensive domestically, but it's the same price being shown the rest of the world market, therefore it flattens it out. So you have a symmetry of a border adjustment import-export wise. And I don't have the result right now, but actually the money from the import tariff pretty much covers the export tariff. It kind of self-finances. I'm not a WTO attorney, I'm not an international trade attorney or anything like that, but it's my understanding under WTO rules this is technically legal if it's non-discriminatory, if it's not thrown up against anybody in particular, if it concentrates on carbon only. So this probably would be legal. I'm not sure that other countries would necessarily like it, but it would be at least legal. I had a economic attaché at IMF or World Bank, I don't remember which, tell me that if the United States did something like this, Canada would have to instantly match our price for the sake of getting rid of the border adjustment. Otherwise, their economy would suffer greatly, because 85% of their imports to the United States. And this is also part of the idea here, is the transmission mechanism. The United States is no longer the world's largest economy. Last week, I think IMF came out and said the Chinese are actually technically bigger now. So that's a kind of watershed moment. For the first time since Ulysses Simpson Grant was president, we are no longer the largest economy on the earth, and we might never be again for that matter. So, is the American era over now? But we're still the biggest consumption economy, and we're going to be for a long time. We have the largest quote-unquote middle class of consumption class. China's bigger, but extremely poor. The average Chinese person has a fourth the income of an American person. Most countries, their biggest export partner is always going to be this one, whether it's Canada, Mexico, Europe, Japan, China, whatever. So if they want to export to our market, it's within their interest to play our game, and therefore this border adjustment becomes a transmission mechanism where countries can have an advantage of having a similar domestic system, therefore they don't have border adjustments, they have competitive advantages. So, sir?
Well, I was going to ask about whether or not this doesn't amount to either an import duty or a subsidy.
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both in the economic sense. In the legal sense, it's neither, because it's not based on it's not based on some national identity. It's based on carbon content.
Right.
And this would be true for all commodities, all bulk agricultural, bulk extracted, whether it's petroleum, gas, mine goods, bulk metals, aluminum, steel, all that, and as much as possible, bulk consumer goods as well. So laptops, all those things. You probably couldn't hit services, but you don't hit them anyways because it's all email. So.
There are countries now that have not a carbon tax, but
a cap and trade or some sort of
yeah.
system, yeah.
And so, isn't that to some extent already analogous to what you're proposing here? And wouldn't that have to be taken into consideration when you're assessing this border adjustment?
I'm going to have to say probably. I can't tell you though every individual country what you would do with that.
Yeah.
All right. So that's the design. This is not the only thing I could assess. This is not the only thing CCL could advocate, but this is, again, I'm kind of playing the job of a private sector CBO. This is the legislation put in front of me. I can't complain about what's in it. I have to score it as it's written. This is exactly what I'm kind of doing here. If anybody has other ideas, there's plenty of CCL members in the room who are probably willing to talk about it. So here's the actual modeling system in cute little clip art graphics for everybody. Everybody like my piggy bank? All right, so I'm going to simplify the system a little bit, but basically right now when it comes to energy, thermodynamics, there's two sources of energy on this planet. There's the Earth, which is fossil energy, basically finite, or at least finite within human time horizons. And there's the Sun, which is essentially infinite. Theoretically, yes, the Sun will expand in a couple billion years to become a red giant and consume the Earth, but if we haven't figured out something better at that point, we probably deserve it. So what we're going to do is tax the blue thing, top center, blue 12 o'clock, on fossil fuels. We're going to take the money from that and put it in the rebate system, so my pile of checks and dollars over there. So that's the checks and the direct deposits from Social Security, whoever it was, to rebate all these dollars. That goes to households. They're going to lose some of that in the form of higher energy costs. I put a gas can to the left of them because that's typically the biggest energy cost for the individual home. Sometimes heating is more, but a lot of times transportation fuels is the biggest one. So yes, they'll get a rebate, and they'll lose some of that in real terms from higher energy costs. What's left over, though, they're going to spend on industries. Industries have supply chains amongst themselves, so they'll spend between each other. A car needs tires, tires needs rubber, rubber needs agricultural products, so there's a supply chain there. That goes in the labor market and therefore further supplements whatever has happened to households. So that's kind of the good side. That's mostly the economic model. That's the positive effects of this. The negative effects are going to be, of course, the higher fossil energy costs. That's going to harm households in terms of real incomes, and that's going to harm businesses in terms of their cost of doing business, which they'll try to pass on to consumers. The biggest determinant of airline ticket prices typically is just the price of refined jet fuel at any given time. So ticket prices and those shadow each other pretty nicely. It's a very competitive industry. Nobody really makes much of a profit, even though it is kind of an oligopoly. So if this made domestic fuel prices more expensive at Baltimore, Atlanta, Denver, O'Hare, the big airports in the United States, all the big airlines would have to raise ticket prices, so they would pass it down to consumers. That's part of the system as well. I don't want people to think that we're avoiding that. That's very much part of the system. Higher costs of production and energy costs in industry would end up on the backs of households to an extent. And that's one perfect example of it, where it's a very easy one to see. Another thing that's going to happen, this is where Patrick's work comes into it, is that notice I only have wind and solar in a coal plant up there. The system's much more complicated than that. It's got nuclear in there, it's got hydro in there, it's got everything. But because of the incentives are different here, because gas and coal are more expensive going into plants, engineers are going to run their plants different, try and cost minimize and profit maximize, and they're going to build new ones in the future differently. So there's a power sector response as well. So that's capital, quote unquote, where it's getting lower returns from coal and gas and maybe getting slightly higher returns from wind and solar might shift itself over. How much? I don't know yet. I've got a graph for that later, but that's the basic idea. All this means, kind of a side effect in the end, to be honest, is emissions go down. And then actually as well, air quality goes up. I'm simplifying a little bit here, but something like half of all air pollution in the United States comes from coal plants, like roughly chromium, mercury, ozone, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, NOx, SOx, all those things. Those are all usually generally accepted as harmful to human respiratory and circulatory and cardiovascular systems. If you are changing around how much emissions of carbon's coming out of tailpipes and smokestacks, you'll improve air quality, just because carbon dioxide is correlated with all these things. Not perfectly, but they do go hand in hand. So air quality goes up. It's not a direct result, but it is an implicit result here. So this is everything that's in the modeling system conceptually. There's one thing in here I'm going to point out that's not here. Can anybody guess what it is? And it's pretty important, at least for the perspective here. No. There's no climate feedback. Emissions go off and stop. It does not loop back into a climate model of sorts. So there's no sea level change. There's no availability of water in the western United States. There's no frequency of intense storms. There's nothing like that. I'm not a climate model. I'm not trained in it. I try to stay rather actually agnostic on the issue because it's not relevant to what I do as a tax and macroeconomist. So basically, any point anybody would ever make about is global warming real? If it is it anthropogenic? If it is it actually a net harm for humanity, counting other effects and all those things? Those are all irrelevant questions to what you're seeing up here because the model doesn't include any of them. Carbon dioxide is emitted and just goes away. It doesn't loop back into anything. So this works essentially as a tax reform study. You don't have to have any beliefs about any of those things I just articulated for this stuff to work.
But if these things are true in nature, then doesn't this become a fantasy? That nature, global warming is happening. It's a very simple. It's a very simple formula. No, I'm making a point because if I'm looking at this, I'm saying I'm big oil. I own all this stuff. All right, you want to take some of my money so that I can help customers afford my higher prices? I'm going to just go pay my lobbyists to go drill holes in your legislation.
I'm not going to talk about the politics of this, but as I said, sir, the whole point here is that there's nothing in this system and these results that require you believing any of these things. And I will tell you, just from a raw political standpoint, again, I'm trying to stay in the middle of all these issues. You walk into a conservative office or an industry office, and if your results depend on any one of those things, that global warming is man-made and it's net harmful and all that, the conversation is essentially over. There's no required belief system in this as a consequence of that. I'm not here to argue like all those other points you make. That's fair politics, fair political reading, but it's not part of this system.
understand that. And it really does depend upon the company you walk into. If you're a company you walk
Exxon
into,
likes it.
no, well, Exxon would take it from his perspective. On the other hand,
They have a lot of gas
You walk in-
assets. They might win under something like this.
you walk into Google, they get. You walk into, any of the alternative energy companies, even GE, because they're building the wind turbines, they get what's going on in the pipe. So as I said,
To be fair, that's all kind of in your self-interest to get.
yeah, or not, but my question really is, how do you define emissions?
Carbon dioxide.
Is that it?
Yes. It's a carbon dioxide tax. That's CCLs. I realize I heard somebody say fusion and methane in here. It's a fair point. Carbon dioxide. That's it.
Are you going to be
CCL
doing the
is-
calculations, because actually your report says that you don't take any of that into account, and that's actually...
I don't.
So then, what are you talking about?
It's
It's
carbon
not the real
dioxide.
world.
It's carbon
But,
dioxide.
but that's not the real world.
CCLs, policy design, I scored as I was asked.
Is it fair to say that your model assumes a constant climate?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's-
So given that the
that's a
climate
very
is a
true.
constant, what's the impact of all of this other stuff in terms of whatever?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll make a note, and this is not meant to be kind of morose, but world emissions, roughly speaking, the United States is about 10%. If you were to get rid of the United States, just tomorrow, sunk into the sea, it's the whole world's emissions go down 10%. This is a truly global issue. This is just the start. So, any other big ones on this one? All right. Build the statistics here enough. And anybody really, really, really wants to get into it, the actual system mathematically ends up looking like that. All right, so real quick, I'm going to go through how exactly we do this. It's 3 different modeling systems. The first one reads. It's impossible to explain, so I'm just going to show it. So this here is a fun, colorful map. There'll be a lot of these going forward. On the left is the current situation. The peachy orange dots, western United States, western Kansas, western Iowa, is wind. The dark black or dark blue ones is coal, gas, and nuclear. So southern United States, midwestern United States. Anybody guess what the white ones are? Hydro. It's TBA. Yeah. So, and there's a lot of that in the western United States, obviously, and parts of New England and further east of this. But that part of the country, most of the dams are through that area. So that's what it is right now. This here is what READS does. It forecasts how the power system is going to change in terms of the type of power plants it has in response to a certain set of assumptions or parameters in the future. It's a model that's built by the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. It's the model used by a lot of the national labs and the Department of Energy to do this kind of research, as well as private sector utilities and regulators, and consultants serving the same. So what it is, it's a mathematical system. It's a linear program that tries to cost minimize. Utilities are regulated, which means they have to minimize costs, or they're unregulated, which means they're going to maximize profits. So it's behaving in the same way that a real-world utility does. And the system that it's modeling, it's a literalistic representation of the power grid, including distribution. It includes variability of power. Wind and solar turn themselves on and off in ways that humans don't have control over in the short term. Day-night cycles of both production and demand. Solar is pretty worthless at night. Wind is actually much better at night. Also demand cycles. Of course, in the middle of the night, we're not using much power. Demand tends to peak in the mid-afternoon. A lot of business activity going on. It tends to peak in the summer with air conditioning. It peaks in different parts of the country at different times. So it's got a literal representation of the power plants, line by line, plant by plant, and then it's got a literal representation of the way demand and supply both fluctuate. It's a representation of the way the grid actually works. And what we're going to do to it basically is, this here is essentially the baseline. This is no carbon tax. What we're going to tell it is, now gas and coal is more expensive as an input fuel. Which means in the short term, the engineers running the plants are going to change the way they run them to try and minimize costs. In the long term, the investors making decisions about how the plants are built and maintained and renewed or not are going to make different decisions as well. I'll have a graph about that later. Next one, CAT, Carbon Analysis Tool. This is kind of your question from earlier about how do you actually determine how much emissions go down. This handles liquid and gaseous fuels. This handles household consumption and business consumptions of petroleum products and natural gas. It's essentially a price elasticity response. Simple version of this is the price of something goes up, people buy less of it. It's based on historical patterns from econometric literature. So historically, just for an example, if gas prices go up 10%, historically consumption of gas has gone down about 6%. And that's a combination of efficiencies, smaller vehicles, shorter drives, fewer trips, it's all the above. That's all this system here is doing. It's based on historical behavioral responses in the fuel markets, gasoline, petroleum, such as heating oil in New England, natural gas in the Midwest and the South, those kind of things. So we've got a different model based on price elasticity to handle this one here. Just imagine yourself that I'm going to say gas is $4 in the long term. It's a little less than that now, but it fluctuates up and down. It might be $4 again by next summer when demand peaks up or if another geopolitical event happens. If it's $4 now and it's going to stay about $4 in the long term, think about yourself. If you knew it was going to be $6, would you maybe behave a little differently in terms of the vehicle you would buy or how much you would drive it or where you would live? Probably yes in most cases. Therefore, you've had a price elasticity response. That's what the system is capturing. And the last part is basically our modeling. I'll have a test of this later. Don't worry, there'll be review sessions, all that fun stuff. It's a simultaneous equation. It's actually a Fortran program, if anybody's ever went back into that. Yep, I know, it's dinosaur code.
That's what I learned.
I know. The good news is I'll always have a job as a utility economist or something for knowing this kind of stuff. For those of you not in the room, Fortran's a math language that was popular in like the 50s and 60s and late 70s, which is when REMI was like started as a research project and founded, and it ain't broke, so we've just been updating it. And whenever we get coders for it, we just hire recent grads and train them from scratch. So it is a Fortran program. Yes, sir?
What version of Fortran?
What I've done here, though, from a modeling perspective, is I've changed a few of the parameters in here. I've changed consumer prices, which includes energy costs. I've changed production costs for businesses, which includes, again, energy costs. I've taken the dividend and put it in disposable income up there, which means it would go to consumption, balanced against the increase in costs. And then I've fiddled around in the market shares internationally a little bit to take account of that border adjustments. That's all I really did to the system. Everything else that goes on inside of here, how much employment's going to happen, what compensation and employment and housing prices are going to happen, is there going to be migration within the United States as a consequence of this? Labor is a mobile commodity. All the people in here have probably moved a couple of times in your life, essentially for life opportunities, quality of life, or chasing things in the labor market. All these are going to change as a consequence of this price and rebate system. That's what this system here is actually rebating, is the macro level effects. Yes, sir?
So if you're going to change the model so that instead of having the money go into, or instead of all the money going to real disposable income,
Yeah.
it was split between real disposable income and incentives for conservation, renewable, and alternative energy programs. How would you do that? I mean, because, helping to fund something like Cape Wind, you would expect to reduce emissions much better than just giving money back to people.
That, in this system, would be basically redirecting money into output for the related industries, whether it's retrofit construction, wind turbine manufacturing. You'd have to basically increase the implicit price elasticity of the system because you're putting more money into that kind of stuff. And at least for the power sector, you'd have to change the upfront investment costs for different types of power types. So you change a couple different things throughout it, but you just kind of shift dollars around inside the system.
Right. Okay, thanks.
And then last point before I get into the results is it's not a national study. I sum up to the nation, but it's actually a regional study. So this pretty colorful map I made here is how the regions are delineated out. I wanted to do state by state, but we kind of ran into some time and budget constraints. These regions are the standard federal regions. They're called the census regions. There's 9 of them. They're just, I didn't come up with them. They're what DOE uses. They're what the census uses. So New England's that blue color. If you are a New Englander and you're patriotic to it, Lot's that dark or that kind of medium blue color. I'm green, Western Midwest, out there. Other parts of the country that may be interesting, of course, is you can probably guess, but this one's going to give you some interesting results, being the big oil, gas, and extraction states. So it is regional. I will talk about some kind of ups and downs inside of here. And that's something I will say that is different about us. You might have seen in other studies. Most other studies, either by the design of the model or the choice of the analyst, will only report national level results. they don't want to essentially give you winners and losers. If a state budget office or CBO is doing this, they will not give results by region or state because they don't want to essentially say this senator loses or this representative wins, those kind of things. They also don't want to play the industry by industry game, which I'm very keen on doing. The fields have the capability to do that kind of stuff for 40 years. We're kind of really, in some cases, the only ones who do it. So it's going to be very, very apparent and open which is up and which is down. And I'm going to argue, I don't want to say these results sound fantastic or anything like that. I think they make a lot of sense in context, but there's a lot of negative numbers here. If I was cooking books, why would I might still leave a bunch of industries and regions negative? So it's honest in the sense that there are negative numbers, and they're very appreciable in that manner. All right, one last concept I'll note to everyone too is that if you see a region that only has a slight change in terms of numerical value, that doesn't mean because the whole region stopped growing or stopped changing. What it means is it's against the baseline. The baseline is just a null hypothesis, a we do nothing forecast, we change nothing. That's without an economic response or a dividend. This gold line here is really what we're going to care about in the sense of how much does it change. What you're going to be looking at most of the time is going to be the gap. It's the vertical difference between gold and blue. We're looking at the impact. How much of a slight change in the margin do you generate as a consequence of something like this? This is not real data. This is nothing. It's just an example of the graph there. So here's the set of results. We'll start with economics. That's our model. We'll go into climate and fiscal. That's CAT. We'll do the power sector, and then we'll do demographics to show that long-term effect. Yes, ma'am?
I just have a question before you get into the results. Well, with the baseline in terms of the supply from recession, how did you deal with did you assume that how did you deal with the different, economic supply based on the diminished actual supply?
The energy portion of the system, we have both the macro model and the REITs model, in terms of how much coal is there, how much oil is there, how much gas is there. It's the NEMS model, which is National Energy Modeling System. It's DOE's model.
Okay.
So it's whatever they think. All those high-level assumptions you just described, or those high-level long-term supply issues, it's Department of Energy's forecast. And I'm not a specialist in that area, so I can't tell them if they're right or wrong. But that's where we got it from. And I'll also say, with the power sector specifically, when it comes to efficiency and cost of power types, what's solar cost, what's wind cost, what's coal, what's gas cost, that's also their assumption set. It's actually, to be honest, the power sector in this is pretty much just proven technology. There's nothing like major breakthroughs or going forward. It's pretty much just proven technology. All right, so we'll kick it off with the biggest one most people look at, which is jobs. So remember my colorful lines here. But it actually works out in the simulations that I've shown you that you actually get slightly more jobs over a baseline than you would have otherwise with the system than you would without. The one exception, though, of course, is West, South, Central. Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, which is technically negative, but in a region of 30 million people, 50,000 is actually pretty close to zero from a statistical standpoint. So it's actually positive. I'll get to why a couple slides from now, but it is actually working out here positive. Let's sum this up to the nation, so we add all the lines up, and we get, roughly speaking, at the national level, 2 to 2.5 million jobs. 2 to 2.5 million jobs is a pretty big number in absolute sense, but let's remember how big this country is. It's 320 million people. It's approximately $17 trillion in GDP. If you benchmark, and then it's about 180 million jobs. So just population growth alone says we're going to have about 200 million jobs in the next 10, 15 years. If you benchmark that against the size of the economy, this one here, it's about a 1% change. It is a change, it is appreciable, but it's about 1% difference over 20 years. In that context, it actually is pretty small against relatively what else could happen. Gross regional product, yes, sir.
Sorry, I was going to ask the question. It's a 1% difference? What's your error factor?
That's a long conversation because it's against a Fortran model, it's a math model, not a stat model. But it's, I don't have a great way to answer that.
Is it your noise, or how much?
No, it's more than our noise. It's definitely more than our noise. It's definitely more than that. But even if it wasn't our noise, that still says your answer basically here is 0, which is an interesting result in itself.
Yes, it is. That's why I asked the question.
But it's 0 with an upward bias, or upward statistical. Okay. All right, gross regional product. Same idea, but now we're looking at dollars, not jobs. Here it's a little more of a mixed story. Most of the regions are positive, but only slightly. Again, you got this guy doing its thing. The dark blue one here is Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Arkansas, kind of mid-southern states, kind of Louisville to New Orleans, or Louisville to Mobile, Alabama. That includes the coal mine areas in eastern Tennessee and eastern Kentucky. So that's where that's picking up on that stuff there. The rest of the regions, though, slightly positive, including New England for that matter. You put this in context, it's about $80 billion, $70 billion of GDP additionally a year. And we benchmark that to the size of the economy. Now instead of a 1% impact, it's more of a 0.25% impact. Frankly, to be honest, this GDP result is almost more of a vestige of the way accounting's done at the federal level by the DEA. It's mostly because crude imports go down. Therefore, we reduce imports, therefore GDP went up in the technical accounting standpoint, even if it doesn't necessarily mean really much of an economic change. So that's why GDP has gone up. Actually, I'll note too is that while REMI really doesn't have like a detailed rest of world concept in it, from a world perspective, this would probably reduce gross world product because we're importing less from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and all that. It just means that the American share of that product is slightly larger because we're importing less. Our economy is slightly larger. The world is slightly smaller. We net out slightly positive. Yes, sir?
Hasn't that been demonstrated in the last couple of months with the oil prices?
To an extent, yes. That's happening at a longer time horizon, maybe a larger scale, but to an extent that's what's happened. We've decreased our imports because the price has gone down.
And the global price is going.
Right. So, let's get to why those jobs go up. Before we do that, though, I want to do this baseline alternative thing. So this blue one here is what happens if we just kind of let the economy go, if we don't mess with the system. The long-term growth trend to 2035, so you can see this little blip here is the Great Recession. This growth trend for the next 20 years is 2%. It's hard forced at 2%. If you look historically, the United States economy has grown at 2% since 1865. So Civil War, there's been some ups and downs since then, but the long-term trend is 2%. We just said why fight history. Can you really see a difference? You can see maybe a couple blue pixels kind of poking out at the bottom there, but from a macro perspective, it basically makes virtually any difference on the scale. I picked out that West-South Central region, which again was the one that was doing the least well. And notice here, it's appreciable. You can definitely see a difference there, but in context, how big is that really? Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas and Houston, or Dallas and Houston are large cities. They're centers of finance, manufacturing, logistics, professional services, all sorts of things, education for that matter. You got the tech sector in Austin, you got the military sector in San Antonio. Oil and gas gets a lot of press, but those are large, diverse economies. So even if you hurt a couple industries, the net still works out to where the area is, relatively speaking, okay in the long term. It is negative for one area. The net for the nation's positive, though, slightly. So let's get into why jobs are positive or negative. This is the GDP contribution by industry type. All the ones at the top are the ones that have a positive effect. And those are all essentially consumer-centric industries. They're all the ones that derive something from the dividend. Think of what you spend your own money on, or what you will as maybe like middle-class adult, or middle-aged adult. Housing, transportation, healthcare, food, some entertainment, electronics, all those kind of things. That's kind of basically what's at the top here. At the bottom, hold on to manufacturing for a second. Nobody likes this result. Like manufacturing is a special industry for a couple of reasons, but hold on to that result for a second. Mining is direct extraction, so that's gone down. That's not a shock. Transportation and warehousing is airlines, railroads, all that stuff. The biggest energy consumer in the United States is the Department of Defense, and it's by a pretty wide margin. I think number 2, though, is the Union Pacific Railroad, and then probably the BNSF, so the major railroads. After that, it's probably the airlines, Southwest, Delta, United, all them. So they're going to pass their costs down to their customer base, and their customer base is still going to buy their products. Like, we're all still going to fly, we're all going to still ship stuff. It's just we might do slightly less of it because of the price effect, so that harms that industry slightly. Utilities is power generation, so that's down negatively slightly as well. So most general consumer industries have a slightly positive effect, while those concentrated in heavy energy consumption or production have a slightly negative effect. Before we do any questions on this, though, I do want to do manufacturing. Here. So this is manufacturing type. I've essentially went down one step in the pyramid, so now I'm breaking out manufacturing types. This one here, petroleum and coal products, this is a weird little kink about the way that the government does its data. Is petroleum and coal products is basically petroleum refineries. Like, that's almost all that industry. So who in here thinks of refineries when they hear manufacturing? I technically do because I know this tweet, but most people don't think refineries are manufacturing establishments, right? Chemicals is the feedstock to refining. So if you take away basically these two, which are related to refining, which is an expected result, basically zero, right? Like there almost is no impact on manufacturing here. There's some slight upsy downsy stuff in the middle. Actually, the manufacturing sector with the best impact under this is automobiles. It's Hyundai, Ford, GM, all those friends. The reason for it is housing's your biggest purchase item, almost in every person's case. Your next biggest purchase item is cars. So there's a lot of extra consumer spending that just goes there. And then also, because the price of oil is going up, or the price of gas is going up, there's more incentive to replace them faster. The fleet turns over a little bit quicker, so there's more than purchased and bought. So this might equal a couple more production lines in Michigan and Alabama as a consequence of it. Yes, sir.
Sorry for tossing in some questions.
Okay.
In these two graphs, what surprises me is, the renewable energy industry, which I would expect you to be manufacturing in the other sector, is not.
It's in there.
Where?
Renewable energy is going to be a combination of computers and electronics and semiconductors, which is solar. Wind is
Solar is considered, okay.
It's a semiconductor.
Electrons.
Yes. And then fabricated metals and machinery, like stuff up there, is going to be like wind turbines and the like.
So that surprises me, because what you're saying is that the solar panel, the category that contains solar panels is expected to go down based upon this model.
Yes.
Based upon this model.
Well, remember this. Solar panels are mostly imported into this country, and the Chinese have flooded the market with cheap semiconductors lately to grab market share, whether it's sustainable or not.
Yeah.
And even if solar production goes up, you have to benchmark it relative to the rest of the industry, and this is a huge industry. This is Dell, like all that stuff.
Yeah, I know, that's the industry.
Yeah, so basically what I'd say there is that the issue isn't so much that the wind and solar and friends do badly. The issue is that industry is actually pretty small in comparison to the macro economy. And I'll get to my example of why that's the issue on my next slide here. So jobs. So this is the job by industry. One industry or two, maybe three, has a negative impact, but notice the size of the impact. It's like 100,000 or so. While these other industries are the same ones at the top as before, they're all very closely associated with consumer spending. So here's my example, is looking at these kind of bottom two industries. There's about 100,000 people working for petroleum refineries in the United States. There's about 100,000 coal miners, mostly in West Virginia and Alaska and Wyoming, but 100,000. There's about 400,000 that work for power generation, so power plants and distribution. About 100,000 that work for long-haul pipelines, so not local distribution, not local utilities, but long-haul stuff state to state. There's about 700,000 people that work for petroleum and gas extraction, western Texas, western Oklahoma, North Dakota, Alaska, those kind of states. You add that whole supply chain up, it's about 1.5 million jobs, maybe 2 if you count some kind of accessory ones and like finance related to it and stuff like that. Anybody know how many healthcare jobs there are in the United States? Anybody? Anyone? Somebody finally guessed too much. It's about 23 million. That is, the healthcare industry in terms of employment is 15 times the size of the petroleum, natural gas, and coal industries. Retail, the one right under it, is about 10 million, or excuse me, 20 million. Some other ones. Construction is about 9 million. State and local governments, about 11 million. Manufacturing, even though it has declined from the 1980s, is still about 12 million. All these other industries basically are each individually in order of magnitude larger in both employment and output than is the energy industry. That's why it looks the way it does, is from a macro perspective, it's just not that big of an industry, all things considered.
So the healthcare and social assistance kind of makes sense because it covers so much of the economy, why there's such a gain. But if emissions is going down, pollution is going down, supposedly people should be getting healthier and would require less health care. Did you take that into account in your model?
That'd be an additional benefit to this.
Which you did not take into account. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Just saying, I'm not trying to promise that because you're right. In theory,
Should is a good word.
Yes.
Yeah.
this would go down, but it would reallocate itself to other industry, and also in theory, it'd be higher quality life and productivity to go with it, which is
All
also
that really fuzzy stuff.
yes. But no, the This is a very strict consumer spending effect. And most people don't realize it, but we spend a lot on healthcare in this country, and it's very labor intensive. So.
Can you explain why the manufacturing industry as a whole reduces its income but increases its employment
Look
slightly?
at the types of manufacturers affected here. Petroleum refineries have almost no labor attached to them. Like literally, there are refineries that have like 8 guys looking at computers running them. Same for chemical plants and the like. Stuff like cars and appliances and furniture and stuff is actually, relative to like a school, is not very labor intensive, but relative to like a refiner is incredibly labor intensive. It has to do with the types of manufacturing. So yes, we might lose some refineries, or maybe more properly, they're just run at lower capacity. I doubt we'd lose any, to be honest, given this change. But if you open up a few more car production lines and a couple more custom furniture factories, that makes up the difference pretty quickly. Yes?
Roughly 10% or so of the fossil fuels, or at least the liquid fossil fuels, is used as feedstock for chemical synthesis for plastics, etc. It's not burned to make CO2.
Right.
So how is that handled in law?
It's treated as if it was burned, to be honest. I've had people make that point to me that for plastic manufacturers and asphalt manufacturers and the like who sequester or capture the product in the product that they make, like plastics, that they should get a rebate. And that, from an economic standpoint, makes logical sense to me. I would be perfectly fine seeing that, but in this system, it's not done. Though I say if you would do it, like this negative impact of the chemical industry would not maybe disappear, but it would definitely shrink itself very greatly as a consequence of that. So it's not treated that way here. That's CCL's choice, not mine, but from an economist standpoint, like if the point is the tax, the use of the commons, that's not the use of the commons in the end. They probably shouldn't be recognized for such. At least I think that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Are you at the end of this? This is construction, or are we just talking about?
Couple more slides. Couple more slides. I just like taking
All my
questions.
horses in that case.
I think I have you guys to the bottom of the hour, so we do have time. All right. All right. CO2. It goes down. Any questions? Again, it's meaningless to me in this model because CO2 just kind of goes into a spreadsheet line. It doesn't go back into anything. It's a result. It's not iterated back through in any way. I used this slide a second ago, or I was showing this to some of the CCL folks before all these nice people came in. This one. But just to put it in some historical context, so the brown line's historical data from 1850. You can see some macro events in there. You can see the Great Depression. You can see World War II. You can see suburbanization in the 1950s and 60s. You can see the oil embargo and the oil shocks in the 70s and 80s. And then now you can see our forecast. If you believe DOE, emissions are supposed to stay basically flat. That's the blue line. Our system, that line I showed you a second ago, knocks it down about this far. So that's rolling back emissions history to either the mid-60s or the mid-40s. So this is the year I think Revolver came out. So in 10 years we could go back to way better music than we have nowadays.
The vertical axis is per year, right?
Yes, annually. It's no cumulative. It's an annual. It's an annual number, not a cumulative number.
Okay.
And it is CO2. Again, CO2, very concentrating on that. Here's the revenues that come off of it. Also a lot of money. I would note that if I did this for longer, if I did this as like a 50-year, not a 20-year time horizon, I imagine that blue line would kind of make a rainbow. It'd start to arc back over, so your revenues would go down. It just doesn't happen in the time horizon I have here, given the elasticity that I used. For context for everyone, the corporate income tax, the whole thing, is like $250 billion. So this is enough to get rid of the corporate income tax in like 5 years. The DoD, the whole defense apparatus, DHS for that matter as well, is about 650. So this is within 20 years enough to essentially fund the entire Department of Defense. So it's a lot of money, very, very quickly as well. Solomon?
Is this axis cumulative or per year?
Annually.
Oh,
Annually. Think of it as more bar charts than it is cumulatively. If it's cumulative, it's like 20 trillion or something like that. Yeah, it's a lot of money. And this is the border adjustment here. Whoa. Touch. I'm good. Okay. This is the border adjustment. Same idea as annual. It's a lot less, but it starts to become more appreciable the further you go along. But this essentially gets eaten up by the rebate to the exporters pretty quickly, so it actually doesn't end up mattering. here is CCL's income. For a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, so the standard kind of American middle-class family of 4. It's by month, not by year. So the first year this thing kicks in, the average family of 4 gets about $48 a month. By the last year, the average family of 4 gets almost $400 a month. That's about $5 grand a year. So it's a pretty appreciable check coming in very quickly. Yes, some of this gets eaten up by the cost of living change, but it is a pretty substantial amount of money. Just for time constraints, I'm going to go over this one. So here's the power sector. I promised you all earlier, and I'm going to have it now. I'm going to note that this is generation and not capacity. Those are separate concepts for those who've dealt with energy economics or power economics. But I'm just going to show generation because it gets the main points across. So this one over here is no carbon tax. Just going through the colors because I know it's kind of small in the back. Blue is coal. Orange is gas. Red is nuclear. This white color here is hydro, which really doesn't change because we're kind of out of places to put dams. The lime green color is wind, and the gold color is solar. So right now we have a system that's dominated by coal and gas. We have a decent amount of nuclear. And what's happening in the forecast is that coal is slowly declining, mostly because existing plants are just going to age out and just retire eventually. They only last so long. The nuclear fleet starts retiring about 2020, 2030. So they're retired and slowly phased out. And what's replacing them is mostly gas and a little bit of wind. Put in the carbon price, and what happens is on market economics, based on the spot markets for electricity, coal plants aren't competitive anymore. And as a consequence, utilities shut them down. That's then falling precipitously in the short term. Not every one. You can see that there's this cross pattern here, like this thing and then this thing. That's for CCS, carbon capture and storage, which is part of the system. There is an implicit rebate inside of this for carbon capture, at least for power generation, not for industrial uses. But theoretically, there could be as well. But for power generation, there is. So what happens is coal plants are shut down. Some survive. There are some large ones in like the West Virginia, Pennsylvania area where they're very large. Coal is very cheap because they're right next to the mine. And storage sites are readily available. So there are a couple large coal plants that survive with carbon capture, just not many. And I don't want to say that this does not like eliminate coal from our economy. There's always the export market. There are some coal plants with carbon capture and storage remaining, and there's industrial uses for it, like making steel and smelting, where it's absolutely necessary. So it's not like it eliminates coal. It just changes its role a little bit. It preserves the resource base in some senses as well, because we're not burning it as quickly. So we go from this system to this one. Now what we've got going on is we've got a base load of geothermal and hydro, particularly in the western United States. Nuclear plants, which would be actually expanded. CCL didn't say no new nukes, don't extend the current ones, anything like that. This is a linear program making a cost minimization run. So nuclear plants are included. It does add some new ones, particularly in the kind of southeastern United States, kind of Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, that area. That's where most of the nuclear plants are anyway, so it adds some new ones. The reason for it is there isn't a lot of wind or solar potential in that part of the country. Maybe some offshore wind, but not much.
No solar potential in the south?
Georgia, South Carolina, compared to Florida and Texas. Again,
I was in that business. I saw the chart. The availability. That's not correct.
it's based on satellite data. I can give you the data if you want to see it, but again, that's how the system's set up. Same thing for wind for that matter. It's all based on satellite data. And what it ends up doing is it adds a bunch of wind towers, adds a decent number of solar farms, particularly in Florida, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. And now we've got a system where you have wind and solar that are being turned on and off by natural forces, essentially the sun and the wind. You have hydro plants and nuclear plants that are backing them, that are running all the time to the base load capacity. And you have gas plants that are being cycled, ramped, with capture to deal with supply cycles, whether it's the middle of the summer or the middle of the day, but also demand cycles, but then also supply cycles. As the wind and solar changes around, the gas plants will make up the difference. Kind of imagine, say, like Kansas City, Missouri, where now they're probably just getting their power from a coal plant. Now they get their power from a wind farm, but there'd be a couple of gas plants nearby for the day the wind doesn't blow, so the gas plants would take over for it. We have less generation. Notice that this is less than that on the long term. because power is more expensive, people don't want to buy as much of it, but we actually have more capacity because we have to make up for the intermittency of wind and solar over the longer term. So, one other interesting result to also put on this too is, again, based on that satellite data, it says that we can only really get about a third of our power, at least without massive efficiency gains, about a third of our current power from wind and solar. There's only that much available resource in North America. So that means stuff like hydro and maybe some gas and nuclear is going to have some role to play unless there's some other efficiency to things that we're not realizing inside. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You don't take into account new technologies that be introduced into.
No.
Okay.
It's proven. There is also storage in here, I will say, because that's not X generation, but storage is included in this as well. And that's part, it's not just gas backing up wind, it's also storage.
What kind of storage?
All the above, compressed air, pumped hydro, everything. Those are the two big ones, though. Yeah?
According to what we can do from the point of view of climate, and I know that you take a neutral position on that, but nevertheless I'd like to know, we have to reduce on a global level the emissions by 7% per year as of today. What is this doing in those terms?
From a world perspective,
Well, no, give me the American perspective.
this reduces it about 20 years, 15
No, not 20 years, per year.
Yes, let me do the math.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sorry. Like 2 or 3, roughly speaking. 50% over 20 years is about 2.5% a year. So,
So it's about a quarter of what we need, actually, if we take into account what we did.
a third, roughly speaking, but of our perspective. So air quality, going through this really quickly. Here's just some high-level benefit cost values. If I'm just counting NOx and SOx, which reads kicks out pretty easily. It's about $80 billion a year, which is a lot of money from a benefit cost standpoint. If you convert this into, say, premature deaths using the valuation of human life that EPA uses, yes, you're all worth $6.2 million. In case you're curious. Just to give this a benchmark, so this is 230,000 lives that would have otherwise ended prematurely from cardiovascular or respiratory illnesses related to smokestacks or tailpipes. Don't happen now. People live out longer lifespans. These are mostly, of course, the very young and the very old, kind of the extreme ages. According to WHO, the United States loses about 30,000 people a year to ambient air quality issues. This would basically cut that in half. So, yeah.
So the New England air quality has a lot to do with who's upwind from us, which is exactly the major carbon dioxide emitters you say that are not within the region. Does this model take that into account?
Yes. It does track that downwind. The thing is, the reason the red and the green, the big ones, is that's where most of the coal plants are. So that's where most of the benefit comes out. Like these red and green areas, that's Youngstown, Ohio, the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, it's the Nebraska-Colorado border, it's the Midwest, the Great Lakes or Great Plains. That's where most of the coal plants are. Therefore, that's where most of the air quality benefit, the way we calculated it, is. And then, actually, it leads to a population change. You get more people in the Midwestern states because of that mortality issue. That's not as much a problem there as it would have been otherwise. And because, you said yourself, the wind solar industries, you saw that green line, that green bulge, that's mostly going to be in the Midwestern states. It's going to be the triangle from El Paso to somewhere in Montana up on the Rocky border to, I'll say Youngstown again. So the areas, the Southwest, the Midwest, both Great Lakes and Plains, where most of the wind farms go. Therefore, that draws in construction work, utility workers, all those kind of things. And it slightly decreases the population in other parts of the country, but it does increase in the Midwest. So that's the high-level result there. You all kind of got this stuff, kind of already drilled you on this. I just want to take one last slide to step through on these, and then I'll take final questions. Main points I make off of this is, as I said, starting off on this, is it's not necessarily mutually exclusive that you can improve the economy and you can improve environmental quality at the same time. For a long time, it's always been thought of as kind of a trade-off, and you can see this is how it's been with like the EPA 111D regulations. Because oftentimes it is done from a regulatory standpoint. It's command and control. It imposes costs on businesses and the economy, but it doesn't do anything to remit them. It's not collecting revenue. For the econ majors in the room, maybe take in international trade or something, you never ever want to do a quota. You always want to do a tariff, because then at least you get some money to remit those who would be otherwise losers. Doing a quota is actually a benefit to those you're trying to take the money from in the first case, because you're allowing them to price discriminate. So that's the first issue. You don't have to necessarily have a trade-off when you look at it as a fiscal issue and you look at it as a macro issue with the import-export of petroleum. Second issue, as I said here, you don't have to have any beliefs about this. Like, you could have a conservative, libertarian, tax reformer, all these kind of things. It's written from that perspective. It's not written from a climate perspective. We could talk about that stuff all day, and somebody was very nice to give me a nice little pamphlet just to inform me. It actually doesn't matter, because again, this has nothing to do with any of those sort of climate feedbacks here. And then the last issue I'll make, and this is more of a pitch for CCL than anybody else, is a lot of people would think that, well, you have all this money coming in, couldn't we do something a little more exotic and attractive in terms of tax reform, or helping low-income people, or helping coal miners, or encouraging renewables, all those kind of things. Those are all fair points, but this proposal has three main features. One, it's pure revenue neutral through a rebate, so there's no tax inspector. So that political argument's eliminated because it is true revenue neutral. Second point is it doesn't mess with the existing tax code. We haven't had a full tax reform in this country since the 1980s, and we thought we'd maybe have one around now, but we didn't, and I don't think prospects are too good until 2017. So it doesn't get wrapped up in Paul Ryan's budget, it doesn't get wrapped up in Dave Camp's budget, anything like that. It leaves that tax reform stuff alone. And the last issue is there's some European states that have looked at using energy taxes or carbon taxes to fund their social entitlement systems. So our equivalent to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, friends. If there's anything worse than tax reform in Washington, D.C., it's entitlement reform, whether it's on the funding side or the benefits side. This doesn't mess with that. It doesn't touch the quote-unquote third rail of American politics. It leaves it alone. If you really look at American government, it's two things, federally. It's a military supported by an income tax, and it's an insurance company supported by payroll taxes. And in theory, they're supposed to be separate. Franklin Roosevelt set up this stuff in theory to be self-financing. You pay for it with your payroll taxes. You benefit from it when you meet certain eligibility requirements, typically age. This would not mess with either of those. It creates its own self-financing and sustaining system on the side that doesn't mess with any of the other issues we don't really seem to be able to deal with at the moment that involve these three things. So that's just an argument to the simplicity of CCL's system. It exists for its own sake, and it doesn't kick any of these other three hornet nests that, again, our politics have had trouble dealing with for the last, I don't know when you want to say the trouble started, maybe at the end of the Clinton administration, maybe after 9/11, maybe after Iraq, whatever it might be, but it doesn't mess with any of those that we haven't got much anywhere on recently. So with that, I'm pretty much done. I know I maybe went technically a little over, at least if at the top was 8, but I'd like to thank you all for coming on this. I'll take questions. And I will note, this is on the CCL website, just CCL REMI report. It's not hard to find. And if anybody wants to talk further, we're on K Street, or we were on I Street. This is my phone number. My cell phone is my iPhone sitting right over there. If anybody has further questions, feel free to call me or email me. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff here. So with that, we will take a few questions. If those you need to leave, just be quiet. Sir?
I'm wondering from the point of view of the climate activists, why do you think you're at all interested in the results if you say that the most important thing was happening not taking into account
CCL. I have to ask that.
Well, it's somebody of CCL here, because the game that's being played here is CCL tells me, oh yeah, there's a wonderful report out there, why don't you read it? It has all the answers to your questions. And I ask you the questions, you keep me back.
Well,
so
I'll give you a high
why
level.
should I be interested?
I'll give you a high
You don't
level.
have to answer.
No, I'll give you a high level what would change. I'll give you a high level what would change. It's not very much, to be honest. Because what that would basically mean is a surcharge on methane on top of the carbon tax that would adjust for its additional climate effect. So what it would mean is that you might get a slightly different distribution between states or different between industries, and you might get a lot less orange in the power sector results and more nuclear as a consequence, but it really wouldn't wholesale change.
We just keep running these things.
Hasn't it?
Well, we haven't dealt with that problem.
Yes, sir.
The amount of money that goes back to the people
Yeah?
goes up to a couple of $100 a month. Okay.
Per family.
I have it memorized per family.
Yeah.
For the poor, don't they actually end up becoming dependent on those checks? Because they're, they take advantage of our polluting characteristics And therefore, that type of dependency becomes a type of welfare where they actually don't, it becomes a disincentive to actually reduce emissions.
Okay, that's true if they can coordinate with each other over the course of 300 million people. The thing is, one...
And how good is that?
Well, here's the issue.
Look what's happening in Washington right
No,
now.
here's the issue. According to CBO and Brookings, they put out 2 papers and they came with the same result. You'd have to give about, according to them, for the lowest quintile, which is 20% of people, you'd have to give them about 10% or 11% of the money in order for the state to meet. I went through and back of the enveloped it. It's in the paper. I didn't have it in the slide deck, where the amount of money going to low-income folks in this system would be basically the same. That is, they, on net, all their additional check should get eaten up by higher energy costs. They should stay even, but actually not get ahead any. What it actually does, the point you're making though, is, all right, let's say you have an individual low-income person. They've just started getting a check, but that check has gone entirely to higher energy costs. They're the same as where they were before in real terms. But in theory, they can do something in their lifestyle to reduce their energy consumption and therefore give themselves a tax cut, essentially. Now, you're right, that if they all decide we're not going to change our behavior, we're going to keep our welfare system intact, yes, but is every single poor person in the country going to, at the same time, choose to ignore the price incentive together?
I mean,
So
the
how
poor
much
people,
more is going to go to the parasites of Wall
with
Street?
the poor people have very little opportunities to actually reduce their consumption of fossil fuels. You know, they're living in subsidized housing.
Yes.
Okay, they can't do anything for their apartment to make it very energy efficient. Most of them that are really poor, you know, whatever gas, you know, they're running old clunkers. We know how energy efficient they are. They can't afford to get a new car because if they did, they would have anyway. You know, this seems to be, you know, perpetuating the trap of the poor.
And it's not meant to solve it, though.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think on net, I'd probably leave them about where they are now. And I think that's not the greatest place. But this thing is not meant as a fundamental welfare reform. This is meant as a let's change the energy sector. So, yeah, I think your point there is perfectly taken. I think they'd probably stay right where they are. Is it the best place in the world? No. But isn't the point of this policy that's what's Pareto optimality? Don't hurt somebody if you can help somebody. In theory, it passes at least the basic Pareto optimality, right?
Yeah, we'll take more questions in a minute just before more people leave. I want to say, if you're interested in the political side of this, there is Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, working all over the country on this national carbon tax. There are also statewide campaigns in several states, including Massachusetts. So if anyone is from Massachusetts or interested in doing politics in Massachusetts, I am one of the regional coordinators for the Massachusetts carbon tax campaign, and would love to have you involved. If you're interested in CCL, you can talk to various CCL people who are here, and I'm sure we'll hang around a little afterwards. Ms. Pam?
Could you talk a little more about, price elasticity of demand as this goes up? Are you assuming that, as these prices get higher over this period of time, how much is energy use affected?
I don't have-
Are you adjusting for that as the price gets higher, or what are your?
It's just a simple linear one, to be honest, and it's phased in. It's 10 years for transportation fuels, it's 20 years for heating fuels and otherwise. And it's basically, I don't know them all off the top of my head, but I know the gasoline one that's burned in there now is negative 0.66. So the first year it's negative 0.066. Next year it's negative whatever 66 times 2 is, 12 or 128. So that's all it's doing, is it's a price response based in over time. The price response of negative 0.66 that takes place 10 years from now, from today's price, is the same as the response that takes place 20 years from now, 10 years from now. So it's a linear phase into the price elasticity of demand. Yeah, very simple.
So if we thought people could get more responsive, or we thought there'd be, people in the short term don't have a lot of ability to change. But over a longer period of time,
Yes.
with transportation, technology,
Yes.
and social regulations as well, I would think that ability to respond to a price change is not that significant, should increase.
Yeah, but it's just based on the literature and our own econometrics conclusion that this historical response for the last 10, 15 years has basically been that number. And I'm not, yes, so I'm not trying to go up or down. I'm going to say this is what it is. It's simple. It's also simplistic. It has its drawbacks and its benefits, but at least it's easy to explain right now to everybody in here who hopefully has an idea of it. In reality, people might argue that, all right, at $4 a gallon, internal combustion engines still dominate. People still buy those vehicles or light trucks. Would that still be the case at 6? Is the response really linear, or is there a tipping point to electrics or whatever? I don't know. I really don't. I just want to say it's a very simple price response.
In Europe, the gas price is not twice in 40 years, and the difference is half. So that experiment has been done, and they're still driving.
Yes, but I can show you again. I'll show you the econometric literature. People have cut back. Like emissions and total VMT's gone down. It's not just what type of vehicle, it's also miles driven. It's everything. It's not just P, it's also Q. Yes, sir?
I think your model and your analysis provides a very useful basis for identifying those groups that are adversely impacted, most seriously impacted by your tax. And that could provide the basis for an analysis of what kind of programs might be devised to concentrate benefits on those groups rather than just spreading it over the whole population.
Right. Theoretically, you could do a lot more in terms of compensating losers, quote unquote, here than just a dividend that assumes to work across all folks. Like, we could just go back to my slide a couple slides ago and just pick out, all right, the workers in these industries. And we're pretty much done, right?
And the next one, it shows the breakdown of the manufacturer.
This.
Yes.
Pretty easy to do, just not part of what I was asked.
No, I know, but others could take that, and if they came to you and said, would you help with that analysis?
Yeah.
You'd be able to do it.
Yeah. And like this one, I don't know, we just came out with a new one. It's for Vermont. That was not revenue neutral. And that was based more on that principle. I'm doing revenue neutral because CCL and Solomon and the Massachusetts folks have been relatively committed to revenue neutrality for political reasons. They don't want to get in a tax and spend fight. It's a big fight, but it's not required by the law whatsoever.
Where's the military in this?
It's not, these are private sector firms.
This is a joke.
Military,
You said they're the biggest power consumers.
they're in the system, they're in their net result. I'm just showing profit, not farm here. They're in this stuff, they're in the macro stuff. I'm just showing the private non-farm industries.
So their consumption of fossil fuels within the borders of the United States would be covered within this law?
Yes. CCL didn't put any rebate for the military. Theoretically, you could have one, I guess, but they didn't.
They would be the smartest to actually reduce their consumption as much as possible because that would have a huge impact on their bottom line.
And actually, I've talked to folks who do strategic planning for them. Oil or gas prices go up 5 or 10%. That changes their total cost by tens of billions of dollars really quickly. It's a big deal for them.
Yeah, but most of the money is actually spent in transporting the fuel, not necessarily.
Yes. There's obviously an aircraft carrier off Australia that has a battlefield around it. That's a lot of bunker fuel.
And I don't think we know how much they spend outside of it. I think that's a secret.
No, we've got a decent idea. You can just use the national product accounts and back out from the IO table how much they spend. It's just we don't have a perfect idea. But we know.
How much more is it inside than outside?
I'm not sure about that one, actually.
It's not a secret, it's just memory.
Okay, does anybody know here?
So it seems like per region it was overall bad for Texas area and good for everybody else. What happens if everyone else influences this and Texas doesn't?
It's a federal law, so Texas can't say no.
So you're, but if the region by region states implemented this plan,
Actually, the funny thing is, the impact on this area would almost be exactly the same, because notice what's happened here. This region's gone down, and everybody else has gone up. And the same way I described at the United States level, part of the reason their economy is as large as it is because they export a lot of the stuff to California and to New York and to Illinois. So if this is implemented in all the other regions, they stop importing it, therefore they stop exporting it. So a lot of this would end up still happening.
would you get the same benefits from carbon drop and air quality?
A lot of it, yes, but what you wouldn't get in Texas and Oklahoma is you wouldn't get the rebate, which means they'd also lose that side of the benefit there.
Better.
They'd be better to join in just so they get their rebate. Might as well be getting it, right? Because the rebate's collected everywhere else, to be honest. They don't consume as much. They export it. Yes, sir?
You're shifting a lot of money around. How important is it that the tax increase similarly every year? Did you do any sensitive analysis on it? If you had a 5-year tax increase and then
It changes the slopes and the shapes of these curves, but it doesn't necessarily change the punchlines that it gives. Yes, ma'am?
I noticed on your table about the relative expected sources of energy, solar was quite small.
Yeah.
And that surprised me.
So this is not me, this is electrical engineers I hang out with talking sometimes.
Yeah.
But basically what they told me the issue with solar here is, according to the way they have their model built up, which again deals with demand cycles and supply cycles and all that, the grid, regionally and nationally, can only take so much variable power. Like the carbon tax could be $1 million a ton, and you can't add any more wind and solar than this because the power system could not take it. And there's not enough available spots in land, quote unquote. There's not enough good wind sites left over. So what they told me is, what if we just have the solar cost just for funds? What would happen? What it would do is it'd start replacing the wind. The reason for it is the engineering characteristics of this stuff up here is just not dependable, and the storage cost is too high because it's basically current storage costs, that it needs to have a half to a 2/3 conventional load to deal with that. So solar, yes, if it was cheaper, it would just start replacing some of the wind. Yes, sir?
One would presume that the cost of fossil fuels will go down with this program because there's going to be less demand for them.
No.
Well, you're using less.
It's an inelastic good, and it's the way the elasticity I just gave out is an inelastic good, which means that the actual sticker price is still going to go up.
Well, the sticker price is going to go up, but the pre-tax, the pre-fee
Yes.
cost is going to go
The
down.
implicit free price would go down if you could untangle it, because it's at the point of extraction that's going to be hard to do.
But the question is, okay, in 1979, when the price of oil doubled for the second time in 5 years, and there was this dramatic rise, there was a dramatic decrease in demand. Within 3 years, we decreased our oil consumption by 20%, from over 7 it was 5.5 billion barrels a year. Okay, and the question I would have, and people did that in response to the dramatic increase in the cost of oil. But if the oil price goes up and then the fossil fuel price goes up, but then it goes down because the demand, the actual...
You're talking in shock terms, and this is not a shock.
I know it's not a shock.
This is a gradual change.
Right, but it's going to gradually go down. To what degree is that going to offset what the consumer is going to see at the pump or the electric bill?
Not tremendously, because it's just, one, export is still available in this system. You can still export the product to the rest of the world market. And two, they're inelastic goods, which means by necessity the price is going up. Yes, it would offset it. It would mean that even if the tax is $100 a ton, maybe the actual cost, and I'm picking a number here, maybe it only goes up 90, just picking a number, but it would certainly negate. It's not inelastic. It's not elastic good production. Yeah.
About the solar and wind discussion,
Yeah.
and the instability grid with smart metering and other types of technologies, it's New England has basically, Massachusetts has a completely deregulated energy market for electricity, so you end up aggregating these net metering systems that effectively create a power plant, put the solar panels and everything through.
Yeah.
But also, has your electrician looked into what has been going on in Germany with the amount of solar panels and wind farms that have been put up, which is a renewable energy, huge amounts of renewable energy being put into the grid, which seems to contradict that assumption.
Again, it's DOE's cost curve, and DOE's storage curve, and again, Germany's a different system than us. It's much smaller. Like geographically, the distribution constraints aren't nearly the issue they are here. We are a larger country, we have more distribution issues. Though actually our next project is what would that take to the United States level. So I could talk to you in a couple months from now. But this is, again, an extremely conservative. Like, I know solar costs have dropped a lot lately, but it's the same argument as the Chinese are just flooding the market. Or I don't know if they are or not, but that's the argument.
There was a company in Evergreen Solar which went bankrupt because of the cheap solar panels.
Yeah. This says that's fake, if not more than fake, actually, for that matter. So if that were to happen, and you could talk about German experience, all those kind of things, again, it's just that's the level of country. And the other issue with it actually too is that wind is in a certain part of the country. Wind resources are not equally distributed. If they're more evenly distributed, you could have more of it. It's just they're not.
Well, in New England, it'd be very good to just put more wind turbines on the coast, but we can see how good Cape Wind is.
Yeah. Well, compare that to like the Primo sites in western Iowa or eastern Wyoming and stuff like that.
Texas actually got some wind.
Yeah, but see, that's in western Texas. Lubbock doesn't need it. Dallas and Houston need it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What is the so now that we have this model, everything looks, it seems like it's something that the nation should do opposed to nothing, right? Most across the board,
Most things are better. Right?
Most things are better than baseline. So now that we have this model, what is next with this model? Is it just a model that says, okay, this is great, we should do this, but we're going to look at it and then 10 years from now look back at it and say, oh, we should have done that? Is this being proposed to somebody specifically? What is it going to take to implement it? Like, what is the next step from here?
Solomon?
Senator Whitehouse just introduced, he's Rhode Island Senator, he just introduced a bill, not exactly this, but along these lines in Congress. Whether it has a chance of passing this session, I don't know. I'm working on a Massachusetts campaign to do exactly this at the state level. And there's this campaign in Washington, and one in Oregon, and one in Vermont. Those are the ones that I know of at this point. The idea being if you start, if you pass this in Massachusetts, like healthcare, like gay marriage, it will start to spread to other...
Revolution.
Yes. And...
There's troublemakers.
Abolition. Anyway, so there are these statewide campaigns. The idea is those will start to spread to other states and set a precedent for national, maybe 2017 would be the opportunity. But there is also, and CCL is devoted to, right now, working on this nationally.
And I'll note, this presentation, I've done it a couple times now. It was last week. It's been a long month. It might have been the week before, but we had a closed session, House side, Senate side, day one, day two. And it was like this big a room. It was full. It was like much more compacted with the Congressional office, but we had like 150 congressional staffers see these results, see this exact slide deck. It was toned down a little bit because I can tell there's a lot more people in U.S. Energy and some climate background amongst themselves. But just to get the high-level results off to them. And it was both sides. Paul Ryan's office was there, Warren Hatch's office was there, Chuck Grass's office was there, Dave Camp's office was there. So people have seen it. At least that's what CCL is getting this word out that way.
Just bouncing back to you based off of what he said.
Sure.
So if we're looking at realistically states kind of addressing this more individually before it can get absorbed on a greater scale, in your opinion, based off of your research or presenting the research, do you think, are the results then still significant enough to say that this is, that it is above the baseline in a significant way? Is it something that or are individual states then going to be, because they have to focus on their own state, making their own legislation, are the results not going to be able to coincide as well as this presentation?
That would really be an issue, and I've done state-level presentations concentrating on states. Like I've done 5 state studies now: Massachusetts, Washington, California, Massachusetts, the sequel, Massachusetts Strikes Back, in Vermont. The results are similar, especially because those are states that don't have the industries that are negatively affected here, and they're not coal plants, so very few many coal plants. So it comes out the same idea. It's just, I actually side with Solomon here, that history teaches us that there aren't usually major reforms Congress at the federal level, unless there's a couple state analogs. Not both left and right for that matter. Think of welfare reform that got proven in Wisconsin before it got implemented at the national level and in parts of Europe as well for that matter. All the way back to, again, Sons of Liberty in 1774, starting in this country essentially, which damn teenagers were doing. So I would think if this is going to happen, and think of Canada, BC has one. The rest of Canada doesn't yet. The way it would happen is just there's some governor, senator, or representative who runs for Congress and gets to a senior position or runs for president. They run on their record. All governors do. All governors are running for president in my book. Just it's a good assumption to have. I would think that the transmission mechanism idea that a couple states do this and have positive examples for the public policy debate, or they literally have whoever's after, I'm just using Devil Patrick, but a figure like that, where that's a successful policy of his, that he then parlays into a presidential or vice presidential run, that is a very easy thing to imagine from American political history.
So you made a comment about British Columbia
Yeah.
carbon tax. It is government control, but it doesn't give all the money back to the people and the corporations. There's a whole litany of tax deductions that are done. And I personally think that Citizens Climate Lobby is referring to the carbon tax in British Columbia in a wrong light from that perspective. But I know. Secondly is your reference to Massachusetts, the sequel.
Yeah.
Okay. Considering I am from Massachusetts, is your sequel still based upon the CCL law?
No. The original was not actually. The original was based on BC, very much so. The sequel is not out yet. It will be out the first. It's bought for the Department of Energy Resources, and it has a lot more of the distributional and implementation issues. I'm not the only consultant on it. But the actual tax model, like the fiscal model, is pretty heavily based on BC.
What about the distribution of funds?
In terms of what you're looking for,
Yeah.
it's the same idea for British Columbia. Certain carve-outs for rural and agriculture and low income, tax cuts and rebates for individuals, increased personal exemption. It's a pretty similar setup.
Any incentives for reducing carbon dioxide emissions, such as conservation of renewable alternative energy, which is part of the BC carbon tax?
Fixed revenue neutral. The Vermont.
No. The BC carbon tax does have.
It's not there.
So, okay, but the BC carbon tax does provide incentives for conservation of renewable alternative energy programs.
The one I can point you to where that's not the issue, where that's actually done, is Vermont. There they were 90-10. 90 for BC style tax cuts and 10 for that one.
Okay.
So I have done it. It's just, it's not the chosen methodology of Solomon and his friends. Senator Mike Barrett, who's sponsoring the legislation in Massachusetts, and our other friends in the West Coast from CCL who commissioned this stuff. But the VPIRG, Vermont Public Interest Research Group, who commissioned the Vermont thing, they were perfectly fine taking 10% of the funds that you're discussing and using them, basically in the way you're describing. So it's been done. It's just not been the choice of the client or the interested party previously.
Okay.